set my spirit free. Oh, Lord, remember me.
Well, welcome to a whole new teaching session. The intent of this particular series is to look at the material that has been brought together in the book of Judges. I need to say right from the very beginning of these sessions that this book is truly post-watershed material. This is not the kind of thing that you watch early in the evening. Although some of the stories in Judges make for great children's stories, they're often used with children, the truth is that this is not really family material. It's not the kind of material that you would use for a nice, relaxing Friday evening at home. What we have in the book of Judges is both violent and disturbing. It's a tragic collection of stories that spiral downwards. Just when you think it couldn't get any worse, it goes and does that. We see a depth of human behaviour here that even in the 21st century, in the world in which we now live, when we're used to seeing the most extraordinary levels of violence being played out right across our globe, even in the context of that, the book of Judges still has the ability to disturb us and to cause us great concern. And of course, inevitably raises all sorts of different questions for us. My intention in this introductory session is to give an overview of the book, to just look at some of the building blocks on which the material can be presented. It just gives us a chance to have the wider view to begin with, and then we'll move on to look at the actual stories themselves. The book of Judges, of course, has a very bad reputation. It's certainly not a go-to book. Whilst there may be some fascinating stories contained within it, the book as a whole is not particularly enjoyable. That's not to say we can't learn from it, but it's just not easy reading. Not only do we see a level of violence carried out by people upon other people that is terrifying and alarming, but also we have to face the challenge of God's involvement in violence and acts that perhaps we consider to be very questionable or even disturbing. And of course, for that particular reason, many Christians will avoid the book of Judges. It makes us think, and it calls into question a lot of what we truly value about our faith and, of course, about the God that we believe in. The problem is, of course, that the book of Judges is contained within the canon of Scripture, and therefore we believe that it has an inspired nature. It is God-breathed. So even though it's tough material, even though it may be controversial in many ways, it is important for us to glean whatever we can in terms of where we are in our present world and where we are in our individual lives. We need to engage with it. And that's my intention over these next few weeks. There is without doubt a pattern contained within the book of Judges, a pattern that we can recognize and define. I need to say straight away that that pattern is not necessarily consistent. Sometimes it's there and it's quite obvious, and at other times it seems to go under the surface somehow and it seems not to quite conform to that particular pattern. However, in general, I think this is a grid of understanding that can help us to discern something of the lessons that the book of Judges really wants us to grasp, that wants to draw our attention to. That cycle looks like what you can see on the screen at the present moment. And although it's a cycle that we can assume is on the surface, of course, the progression of the cycle is in a downward spiral. In other words, it begins in a bad place and it ends in an even darker and worse kind of place. So let's have a look at that grid. You can see it on the screens in a numerical order. Firstly, there's that sense of losing touch with God. God's people, his covenant people, Israel, lose that vital connection with him. Secondly, then, they take on the gods of their neighbours, the surrounding nations, those that they live alongside. Thirdly, they end up facing judgment. They end up being punished by God in all sorts of different ways because of their failure to keep the covenant promises, their faithfulness to God. Number 4, as a result of that, they reach the point where they cry out to God for help in the midst of the terrible turmoil and conflict that they're facing. Number 5, in response to their cry, God hears and he sends them a deliverer, what we call the judges. And then finally, number 6, people, once they have been liberated from the oppression that they have faced, well, there's an enormous sense of relief. But it doesn't end with that. It just continues to cycle, time after time after time. And every cycle seems to take us into greater depths of despair and despondency and human behaviour. I guess the book of Judges, if we take it as a whole, certainly provides a warning for us. It's a theological warning. The message is very clear. This is how things end up when people go their own way and ignore their covenant commitment to God. Even what we might describe as the heroes and heroines of the book, they're all tainted in some kind of way, maybe with the exception of Deborah. And at that point, it's interesting to note that this is one of the few books in the Old Testament that acknowledges the leadership role of women. So it's quite important in that sense alone. This is a book, though, that is not without hope, even though it's a book that might cause us to think, oh my goodness, what's going on here? How can people treat each other like this? How can God respond in such a way? The book is not without hope. And of course, the hope is, what we see there, is that God doesn't abandon his people, even though time and time again, they clearly abandon him. God is continuing to work out his purposes, both through the good and the bad. And of course, God's prepared to work with what we might call flawed people. And I guess that might be an encouragement for us to know that even though at times, I'm sure, we are flawed people, God is still able to bring about his plans and purposes through our lives. And that's a theological observation that the book of Judges makes. Let's think about the term judges. I think when we come across the word to judge or a judge, we have a particular picture in mind. And in every sense, these particular judges, as we find them called in the book of Judges, don't really conform necessarily to that particular picture. I think it would be better perhaps to see them as tribal leaders. They're not national figures, although they may become national figures. They clearly are prominent leaders within their own individual tribes. So we might talk about them as being a ruler, or maybe a governor, perhaps, of a particular tribal area. So in that sense, that's probably a better way of defining them, although traditionally, as we know, within the book, they are known as judges. They follow on from Joshua, of course, and like Joshua, they are called individually to uphold the values of the covenant and to bring about justice and righteousness. Clearly, this is a book about justice and righteousness, theologically embedded within its material, even though it's difficult always to see that initially when we begin to read on the surface of the book some of the terrible things that are taking place. Some of those judges do that better than others, as we will find. The judges, as they're known within the book, span that period between the death of Joshua. Joshua, of course, led the people into the promised land that had been promised, of course, to Abraham and his descendants. And it goes between that, the marking point of the death of Joshua and, of course, the emergence of the monarchy under the first king of Israel, who, of course, was Saul. So generally, it's set in a time frame of around about 1200 BC through to roughly around about 1020 BC. When these stories were collated is not particularly straightforward. Probably some of them may well have been collated during the reign of David, but they obviously undergo a series of editors and co-editors, schools of thought that bring the material together, and probably not completely brought together until after the second exile, the exile of God's people Israel in Babylon. And of course, by then, that material would have helped the exiles to see why things had turned so badly for them. It plotted the stories that reminded them that if you reject God, if you refuse to keep your covenant commitments to God, then this is how you end up, which was a way, of course, of helping people at that time to interpret the events around the second exile. Different influences can be seen in the book of Judges, which suggests that different themes and different thoughts has gone into this particular book. Probably one of the most dominant is that it appears to be very pro-monarchy in its outlook. It clearly says to those who perhaps doubted that the monarchy, the establishment of the monarchy was the right thing for the people of Israel, it's clearly saying, well, you've only got to look back to the time when there wasn't a king on the throne, and what a terrible time it was. So in that sense, it reinforces the whole idea of the monarchy as being central to the well-being of the nation. Of course, the book of Judges, as all books within Scripture, are not to be read in isolation. We have the canon of Scripture, what we call the 66 books, and of course, Judges, like all other books, should be read in the light of the whole of Scripture. If you turn back to the book of Exodus, you see that that spirit of rebellion that is so obvious in the book of Judges actually didn't start in the book of Judges. As you go through that long period of wandering in the desert following the liberation from Egypt, you can see that that spirit of rebellion was alive in the community of Israel. Prior to that, if you go back into the book of Genesis, particularly the opening chapters of the book of Genesis, you see that God's love and concern is not just for one people, but for all people. And so, again, that helps us to see in a wider context what the fundamental drift of Scripture, the direction of Scripture, is helping us to gain some understanding. The book of the prophets, which of course follow on from those books that deal with the monarchy, the books of the prophets are continuously setting out to call people back to the themes of justice and righteousness, for God's people to renew their covenant commitments. So taking all of that, and then of course into the New Testament with the revelation of Jesus and the church and God's reaching out beyond the nation of Israel into the whole world, we see a theme emerging in which a context emerging in which the book of Judges needs to take its place. So we have to read it in the light of all the other material that we know make up the whole canon of Scripture as it's known. This book, I need to say, does not justify violence in any way. Over the years, sadly, there have been those in the church and even today some Christians who will refer to the book of Judges as justification for violence against what they perceive to be God's enemies. If you set the book alone, well, you may want to draw that conclusion. If you set the book in the whole of Scripture, there simply is no way that you can arrive at that particular conclusion. Two themes emerge out of the book of Judges, amongst, of course, many others. The first is land. Living in a particular place at a particular time doesn't necessarily define you as part of the covenant community. Now, the people of Israel wouldn't have grasped that at that time. They believed that the land that they possessed, God's promised land for them, was a sign that they were in fact part of the covenant community. But what the book of Judges wants to tell us is that the land where you live it has no relevance if you are not keeping your covenant commitments. So if you are keeping your covenant commitments, then you are part of the covenant community. If you're not, even if you live in the land that God has given to you to possess, you remain outside of that covenant community. The second theme that emerges is the people that we call the Canaanites. Clearly, the authors use and editors use the term Canaanites to represent all those who seem to stand against God's purposes and plans for justice and righteousness and truth. God doesn't hate the Canaanites as a people. He only acts against those who intentionally set out to thwart his plans and purposes. What we see is that God acts against those who continuously, habitually go against those great themes of justice and righteousness and truth. And if they do that, then God will act in righteous judgment against them. And that group is given this generic term, the Canaanites, in the book of Judges. So, of course, that means that if Israel, someone from the community of Israel, is thwarting God's plans of justice and righteousness, then they too could be described as being amongst the Canaanite people. God's own people can be Canaanites as well as true community members of the covenant of grace and law that God brought in these Old Testament days. So let's finish with just a further observation. We like the idea of beginnings and ends, and it's often argued that the book of Judges is bookended by two passages of Scripture. So in that sense, the opening chapters, as we'll see next time, we look at chapter 1 through to chapter 3 and the initial verses of chapter 3. We come to that verse in Judges chapter 3 and verse 7, which seems to be the start, if you like, of this particular narrative. What has gone before is a point of reconnecting with the story. It engages us and reminds us of where we've been. And that verse in verse Judges 3 and verse 7 says this: "The Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord. They forgot the Lord their God and served the Baals and the Asherah." So that kind of is like the beginning of the adventure that we're going on in the book of Judges. And then, of course, it concludes right at the end, the other bookend, if you like, in Judges 21 with that verse in 25. "In those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did as he saw fit." So that's the two bookends, if you like. And as we see next time, the material prior to chapter 3 and verse 7 is a transitional passage that will help us connect the stories of Joshua with, of course, the emergent stories concerning the judges prior, of course, to the establishment of the monarchy. So those are the building blocks we're working with, and we'll revisit those as we go into that opening session next time. So thank you for joining with us this evening.
Chains get broken, set my body free. Oh, Lord, remember me, remember me. Set my spirit free. Oh.